So we've been talking about Nehemiah, and I love the book of Nehemiah. And boy, the more I dig into it, the more I really love it. And we've been looking at leadership lessons. And we've said that the first thing that a leader does is they pray, right? We talked about that. And then we looked last week at the fact that leaders plan. How many of you know you got to plan things out, right? So the next thing that we have to do is they have to actually present their ideas. So you pray and then you plan, and at some point you actually have to do something. This, I think, is where a lot of Christians get stuck, because they'll always go, oh, I've heard from the Lord. Yep, and they start planning, but then I'm waiting on the Lord. That's what you hear next. You don't hear, I'm going for the Lord. You hear, I'm waiting on the Lord. And then we kind of wait, and we wait, and we wait, and then another year goes by. Oh, but I'm waiting on the Lord, with such great faith. But actually, we are called to go, and I think of waiting a little bit differently. I don't think of waiting as sitting and waiting. I think of waiting as like a waiter. I'm serving, right? That's how we wait on the Lord, right? Lord, how may I serve you? And now let me serve you. So Nehemiah, the next thing he has to do is he has to present his idea to the people around him. So he's gone to Jerusalem. The king has given him favor. He's given him everything he needs. He's given him this entourage. And now he goes. But how many of you know that success is never a one-person show? Amen? It just isn't. It isn't. When he goes to Jerusalem, first of all, he needs other people. Otherwise, he won't be able to rebuild the walls. I mean, that's the reality. We need help, right? And that's how we all come together to build. And when he gets to Jerusalem, he finds a people that are not necessarily really ready to go, because they've quite been defeated, right? These people had been defeated. They were apathetic. They were living among ruins, right? Remember, the walls were torn down, and it had been that way for some time. And twice before that, over the 90-year period, somebody had actually tried to come and rebuild the wall. And every time they tried, they failed, right? So for 90 years, they've been saying it can't be done. And now here comes Nehemiah. He arrives on the scene, and within a matter of days, he rallies the support of an entire city, and he rebuilds the wall in 52 days. The question is, how did he do it? How did he pull that off where others had failed? Was he a miracle worker? No. He was just a really good leader. And he understood the principles of motivation. Have you ever needed to motivate anybody to do something? Teachers would be probably really familiar with this one, right? And maybe leaders in business, right? You have to motivate people to do something. Even in your own family, to motivate a child to clean their room or something, right? We all, to some degree, need to motivate people to do anything. And he understood the principles of motivation. And so we're going to look at that now, how a leader motivates people. So we're going to look at Nehemiah 2, 10 to 20, and I'm going to try to do this at the same time. I'm making it a little bit bigger for you folks, so there'll be more slides. But hopefully maybe I'll just read it here. When Sanballat and the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Amorite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Nehemiah inspects Jerusalem's walls. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one that I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. No share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to... Oh, that didn't look right. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who had been doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." Now, Nehemiah goes to rebuild, and what is the first thing that happens when he gets there? In fact, it actually happened before he even got there. And this is something that we need to expect as well. I think sometimes we're shocked by it, but the reality is we need to expect opposition. The fact is that the moment you said, "Let's do something," someone will jump in and go, "Let's don't." Anybody? Yeah? When God's people rise up to build, to say, "Let's build," Satan says, "Let's arise and oppose." It happens all the time. People are naturally resistant to change, and so it's easy for the enemy to come in and convince people to just stay in the status quo. A lot of people prefer that place, but leaders figure out what those reasons are and deal with them. So we anticipate, hey, there's going to be some opposition to this, and that's what Nehemiah did. Remember, he planned well in advance, so he would have known that there would be opposition. It says in Nehemiah 2:10, when Sanballat and Tobiah, the official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that some would come to promote the welfare of Israel. Isn't it funny why would anyone want to oppose promoting the welfare of anybody? But he names these two leaders of the opposition. And you'll find these people all through the book of Nehemiah. They were always trying to get at him, right? Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, and Tobiah was the leader of the Amorites. And Nehemiah had not even arrived in Jerusalem yet, and these guys were already opposing him. How did Nehemiah know they were going to oppose him? As I mentioned, right? He would have sent scouts ahead, advance, to find out what's going on, what's happening, right? There are few opportunities without opposition. That's a fact. If we're going to help people or we're going to change a situation, we need to expect opposition. And I'm sure people are thinking right now of things that are happening even right now in Australia where that's true. The second thing is that we wait for the right timing. That's the other thing that leaders do. They wait for that right timing. In motivating others and suggesting change, timing is everything. Have you ever had a good opportunity killed because of bad timing? Yeah. Timing makes a big difference. In verse 11 and 12 it says, "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out." So he stops for 3 days. He doesn't just make some grand entrance, right? He doesn't proclaim, "I'm here to save the day, dun, da, 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 let's get to work," right? No, he arrives in Jerusalem, and he doesn't just grab bricks and mortar and start to work. He didn't even announce why he was there for 3 days. In fact, for 3 days, he did nothing, right? So what was he doing for these 3 days? It doesn't say. We don't really know. But there's 4 possibilities. One, he was probably resting and recovering after a long journey, right? Because he was on a camel, he's crossing over the desert, right? And this is another leadership lesson. Never make a major decision when you're tired, because fatigue clouds your perception, right? Never make a major decision when you're tired. He may have been praying, because we know he was a man of prayer. He's hit the ground now. Let me take some time and just pray. And he's likely planning. He's probably reviewing his strategy. Okay, I'm here. Let's see how we're going to get this done. And he's probably building curiosity, because if you think about it, he arrives with a king's escort, right? So here he is in this town that's been defeated and discouraged, and he goes to where he's staying and he says nothing for 3 days. Now, wouldn't that cause a little curiosity? Here's this guy, the big king's entourage, and he does nothing. It's like, what is this guy doing in Jerusalem? What's his plan? What's he here for? What's he doing, right? So by the 3rd day, everybody's already heard of Nehemiah, and they're wondering, what is this guy up to, right? He's using it for psychological buildup so that when he presents, people are listening. Now, all right, what's this guy up to? Now he's going to tell us we need to hear it, right? Ecclesiastes says that there is a time to be silent and a time to speak, and Nehemiah understood that. In Ecclesiastes 8:6, it also says there is a right time and a right way to do everything. So you got to wait for the right timing. Jesus had a profound sense of timing even in his ministry, right? Many times in his word, he would say, it's not my time yet. My time has not yet come, right? Timing is very important. The third thing is that we have to get the facts first. Get the facts, right? In verses 12 to 16, we have Nehemiah's research party, and they're actually going out now, and they're inspecting the walls. He says, I set out during the night with a few men, and I had not told anyone what my God had in his heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding. By night I went out through the valley gate to the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. So he's going out and he's having a look. He's sneaking around, really. He explains at midnight he's out traveling the walls to inspect them. He's personally inspecting the damage in the middle of the night. And he takes this small group with him. He's obviously didn't want to attract too much attention just yet to his plan. Remember, people had failed before. So he wanted to be ready, wanted to be prepared. He's doing his homework. First, he's preparing and checking it all out, right? Verse 14 says there was so much rubble that he had to get off his horse and walk through it. And at this point, the size of the project probably starts to sink in. You know, he's like, yeah, you know how it is, right? You're going to champion a cause. Yeah, I'm going to champion a cause. And then you go and you go, oh, right. This looks like it might be a bit of work, right? And this is what he's seeing. He's probably thinking, this is much worse than I thought. Why did I even volunteer for this? Because he's never built anything in his life, but he's going to do it. In verse 16 it says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials, and they didn't, or who would be doing the work. So he's been doing a secret survey, basically, because he didn't want the plan to be stalled before it even got started. If he had started going out and they knew what he was doing, they'd be telling him, oh, mate, look, they tried that. They tried this. It didn't work. 90 years of negativism, and he had to get the facts, and he had to get them right. It's easier to promote a good idea. Is it easier to promote a good idea or kill a good idea? A lot of times it's easier to kill it, because of that whole status quo mindset, right? Have you noticed that negative people tend to be more vocal than positive people? Anybody? Yeah? Nehemiah doesn't have all the facts yet. So before he does anything, before he announces it, he says, I'm going to get the facts. And that's another leadership lesson. Leaders protect their plans from premature death. Think it through. Have the plan made out, right? Proverbs 23:23, but the truth, buy the truth and do not sell it. Wisdom, instruction, and insight as well. It's important to have the truth, to know what you're talking about, right? And then Proverbs 18:13, spouting off before listening to the facts is both shameful and foolish. We've all done that, haven't we? We spout off and then we find out, oh, I didn't actually have that right. And then we have to eat humble pie and go back and apologize. In Proverbs 14:15, only simpletons believe everything they're told. Be prudent, carefully consider their steps. So that's another good lesson. Good leaders do their own and confirm their own research. Don't just rely on somebody else. You know, Paul was always saying, check out what I'm saying, right? He told the Bereans, they're noble. Not only are they listening to what I'm saying, but they're checking it out to make sure that what I'm saying is true. So we've got, he would have been hearing, oh, we couldn't do it. No, he's going out, he's doing his own research. He's going to get the facts so that when he presents, he's got answers for people. Nehemiah understood his opposition, and he was creating curiosity, and he's gathering all the facts. Now, finally, Nehemiah is ready to lay all his cards on the table. In verse 17, it says, then I said to them. Now, here it is, right? So he's ready for the fourth step in how to motivate people. Identify with people. He had to identify with them. All good leaders do this. They identify with people. Hey, I'm one of you. I've come to help, right? he says, then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Come, let us rebuild, and we will no longer be in disgrace. He didn't walk in as an outsider, having never been to Jerusalem, say, hey guys, you're a bunch of failures. Let me come support you and we'll rebuild this thing. He didn't do that, right? It's been 90 years, nothing's been done. And when you blame other people, you decrease the motivation. He didn't come in and say, oh, those guys, they're just a bunch of losers. Follow me, I know how to do it. He didn't do any of that. When you accept the blame, you increase the motivation. He doesn't play the role of an outsider, right? He doesn't say, I'm going to rebuild it. He says, I'm one of you. It's our problem. We're in this together. Basically saying, look, we're all in the same boat and it's sinking. We're in it together. Good leaders identify with people. That's good for motivation. You get a little bit better response from people when they feel like you understand them and you identify with the problem. So when we go out, when we talk about our community, when we talk about faith, we don't come in with some Christianese that somebody doesn't understand. That's like, it's like telling a starving man, oh, come to Jesus, but you haven't even fed him yet. You haven't even given him a sandwich. You haven't even met his need. You haven't even said, man, I get it. And sit down with you. I can talk with you. God, we're all different. We're all unique. We all come from different experiences. Why? So that we can relate to somebody else. Jesus came and he related. They spit in his face. They mocked and ridiculed him. He's relatable. If he didn't become human, he wouldn't be relatable. He did that in human form. He's relatable. And we need to just be able to identify with people. Just be real. Just be yourself. Be who God created you to be and just relate to people. That's what he did. He said, I'm one of you. I've come to help. And then the other thing he did, the fifth thing he did, is he dramatized the seriousness of the problem. Rather than minimize the problem, Nehemiah dramatized it. In 17b, he says, Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. This is one place where being a drama queen helps. Go ahead, bring the drama. Oh my God, the walls, they're in ruins. They've been burned with fire. Don't you understand? Let's help. Let's rebuild. Come on. These are emotional words, right? He places, he says the place is in ruins. It's burned with fire. We're a disgrace. He's dramatizing the seriousness. Why? Because they've been living with it for years. And isn't it a fact that when we live with a bad situation long enough, we start to ignore it? It's true, isn't it? If something breaks in the house, and I can tell you this because we have a faucet, it's been broken forever. If something breaks in the house, for the first couple of weeks, it's a pain in the butt. Oh, it's broken, we really need to fix it. But if the longer you wait, it kind of stops bothering you so much. You just get kind of used to it, don't you? When you live with a situation long enough, you can become apathetic to it. How long are we going to sit as wounded birds? Because that's not who we are. Right? We are eagles. We are meant to soar. We are meant to soar. The fifth step, he refocuses their attention to the problem. Hey guys, we've got a mess here. He gets them to face the facts. There's a wrong perception going on in our community about who we are. Let's face those facts. Step 3 is the leader faces the facts. Step 5 is the leader gets the people to face the facts, right? Change never occurs until we become discontent with where we are. If you want to create change in your school or your home or your office or wherever, one of the marks of a leader is that they create discontent. We can't stay in this place anymore. It's not healthy. It's not comfortable. If you're content, you are most likely not really going to want to change. It's comfortable here. I think that's why babies scream when they're born. They were quite content in the warmth of the womb, floating around. And now all of a sudden they got to come out and it's cold and I don't get it. And wah! Right? We like that place. We like that place. But once it becomes uncomfortable, we need to do something about it. That's how you create motivation, sadly. I know that's how I got moved when I first moved here, is my living arrangement became quite untenable to the point where there I was on the sidewalk with my suitcase going, well, Lord, I probably should have listened to you last month when you said it was time to move. Thanks for the help. Now I'm discontented. Now I have to do it. Because in our humanness, we don't always get it right? We have a tendency to hold on to, it's warm here, it's comfortable here. But that doesn't change anything. So we're going to have to put up with some criticism, because everyone who stirs the pot can be in trouble. When we start to say we're not content any longer to put up with this, when we start to moving, we're going to receive criticism because we're shaking up the status quo. That's the mark of a good leader. We don't just sit around. We get up, we move, right? We break the status quo. That's what we're doing right now as a community. We're saying enough's enough. We're not content anymore. And we're getting up and we're doing something about it. Nehemiah used two motivators. He appealed first to their self-esteem. He said, we got to get out of this, and we've got to build. We're in disgrace. We're God's people, and we're living in rubble. I think that was a breath of fresh air to these people. This leader's different because he's actually concerned about us. He doesn't have his own agenda. He's concerned about us, and he realizes that we're demoralized. He says, I want to come in here and raise your level of self-esteem so you're not in disgrace anymore. It's a strong motivator, right? We are mightier than we think. But even deeper than that, he appealed to an even higher motive, which was concern for God's glory. Not only were the Jews being disgraced, but God was being disgraced. The Jews are God's people. The whole world was laughing at them, right? Those poor Jews. They say they worship this true God. They can't even rebuild their own city. It was an embarrassment to God, and it was a poor testimony. When Nehemiah said, we're in disgrace, he was not only appealing to their personal self-esteem, but he was appealing to the fact that God's name was being defamed. How many of us can say amen to that today? If we represent a God who is all loving, then why do some people think he's not? What are we representing? And are we enough discontented about it to do something? I think we are. We all sense that God's getting ready to move and that God is moving. So I think we're at that stage now where we're ready to say enough is enough. Notice that Nehemiah didn't use external motivators. They were both internal, self-esteem and God's glory, right? He didn't use some external motivator, didn't say, okay, guys, we're going to build the wall, and whoever gets their section done first gets an all-expense-paid trip to the Dead Sea. He didn't do that, right? He didn't offer that type of motivation, right? Go float for the weekend. No, right? Leadership lesson. The greatest motivation in life is not external, but internal. And it's not even internal, it's eternal. Right? Nehemiah says, let's rebuild the wall for the glory of God. So God's name is not in disgrace. Let's rebuild the wall for the kingdom of God and for the glory of his people. He challenged them with the right kind of motivations. And the sixth thing he did was he asked for a specific response. You don't just get people excited. You don't just say, okay, here's what we have to do, and then held this big rally and then say, wasn't that fun, and then we all go home. No, verse 17 says, everything is a mess. Let us rebuild the wall. Right? He calls for action. He appeals for help and asks for a specific response. So leadership lesson. Leaders see both the real and the ideal. They see what is, which is the mess, but they also see what can be. They see the wall. You got to see that's what is and what is actual. Those two things brought into harmony produce good leadership. Leaders see what's real and they see what's ideal, and they know how to get people excited to help, to create. Leaders are not afraid to ask for assistance. Not too many of us like to ask for help. How many of you know that, right? We all kind of go, oh, no, I'll just do it myself. Oh, it'll just be so much easier if I do it myself. I am horrible with that. I can tell you, and I confess, I am horrible with that. The second thing is you encourage with a personal testimony. In verse 18, we have Nehemiah's story, and there are two parts to it. It says, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me. He tells them about how God had called him to lead the project, right? The second part, he tells them how circumstances were confirming his calling. I also told them what the king had said to me. He's saying, I didn't want this job, but I was praying over there in Susa. And as I prayed for 4 months, I got this burden. And the more I prayed about it, God said, why don't you be the answer to that? The burden turned into a vision that Nehemiah had. I said, okay, God, I'll do it. It was really God's idea. He called me to come and do this project. Not only did God call me, but he confirmed the call when I went to the king, and the king said yes. And he gave me a cavalry guard, and guess what, guys? He's going to pay for it all. That's a powerful testimony. That's a legitimate thing to ask people, too, when they say, God told me to do this. It's a legitimate response. Is anyone confirming this in your life? Or is it just something you thought up? Are there any confirmations to the sign? That's why we've been sharing testimonies as part of this series. And Sharon actually has one that she's going to share next week. But I've got one from last week. So we talked last week about planning and going before the king. So you plan it all out so that when you go before the king, you know what to say. You've already got it planned, right? So Kenny says to me after the service, he says, oh, I'm on a 1-year contract. I've really been praying for a permanent contract. And I just feel like, it's time for me to go and to ask, And so on Monday, we get this message and it says, oh my gosh, I now have a meeting with the principal to talk about my role. I was just praying this morning for an opportunity, and then today he asked me. So on Monday, Kenny will be going to talk about his position with the principal. Now let's keep him in prayer because he now has audience, but he's planned it out. He's ready to go. Now I told you also that I was planning to go to my boss and to say to him, I no longer want to work for you as an employee. I want to come back as a consultant. So I went to my boss and I had my meeting on Friday. And he looked at me and he kind of said, I think the timing on this is quite good. Yes, let me talk to HR and we'll find out what we need to do to sort it out. Now, we've still got to work through the details. But this scripture keeps coming to my mind. It's Psalm 21:1. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. Over and over, God has used pagan kings to deliver favor to God's people. Our testimonies are powerful. They're powerful in motivating people because now we can see God's hand in it. Now it's not just lip service. We're not just saying, oh, I think God called me to come to Australia. We're seeing that God paid for it, that God made a way for it all. What's your story? What has God done for you? As I said, Sharon will share one next week, so I'm pretty excited about that. Nehemiah shares his testimony of how God called him, and the circumstances confirmed his calling. In verse 18b, we see the people's response to it now, right? He says, I told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said, and they replied, let's start rebuilding. They were excited. The vision had been transferred. It's not Nehemiah's vision anymore. It's the people's vision, right? Because God's in it, right? So why did Nehemiah use his personal testimony to motivate? Because he knew one of the classic lessons of leadership. People follow people, not programs. We are all followers of Jesus Christ. We are all followers of our God. His God said, go. And they could see God's hand on him. And they got excited because they know that this is God's vision and plan for them. Right? Yes, Nehemiah went to lead, but they saw God doing the work. In 1 Corinthians, I think it's up there. Yep. 11:1, Paul said the same thing. He said, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Why should anyone follow you, a leader? Why should they, right? What should they see in you? The answer is people should see God's hand on your life, because ultimately God is the leader. We all just do our bit, don't we? When people can sense God's Spirit in your life, and they can sense God's hand on your life, then you're ready to be a leader. As a pastor here, if you can't see God's Spirit in my life, don't follow it. Right? But if you do see God's Spirit in my life, God's hand in my life, then support the leadership and help out where you can. Right? It's a test for all of us in leadership. It's not just education and talent. It's, is the hand of God on the person's life? Is God in it? Because if God's in it, we win it. Right? There are a lot of talented people that you shouldn't follow. There are a lot of people whose credentials you shouldn't follow. They have a great credential, but do you see God's hand in their life? The 8th thing, I think this is the final thing, is answer the opposition quickly and confidently. In verse 19 it says, but when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, the Arab, heard about it, they mocked us and ridiculed us. Now here's another guy mentioned. At first it was 2 guys. There was just the 2, Sanballat and Tobiah. Now we notice the opposition has expanded to include a 3rd party. How many of you know that opposition usually grows as the project continues? And we get, further into Nehemiah, we're going to see 6 different times that they had opposition, where they got this opposition from these guys. The opponents' strategy was they mocked and ridiculed them. They laughed at them. You'll never be able to do that. Who do you think you are that you can do this? Right? The disciples went through it as well, didn't they? Even Jesus was mocked. They laughed at him. And in Nehemiah's case, it's no different. Those Jews are never going to get this thing built. They haven't done it in 90 years. They won't do it now. And that's what happens to us. We hear that opposition, and we take that on board. But we're not meant to take that on board. The second thing they did is they accused him of rebelling against the king. This excuse had been used before, and it worked with Ezra, where they said, oh, you're going to rebuild those walls, and once you do, you're going to forget paying any taxes to those people. Right? It's why the king issued the decree in the first place, to not allow them to rebuild the walls. And they used that in Ezra to say, no, you can't do this, because if you do that, it's rebellion against the king. And they went to the king and they said, these guys are trying to rebel, so don't allow them to rebuild. And that's what happened, and they didn't rebuild. So this is not new opposition. The reason it didn't work now is because Nehemiah is no pushover. He's going to address it straight away. In verse 20 it says, and I answered them saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem, any claim or historic right to it. See, Nehemiah refused to argue. He didn't get into an arguing match. If you're wise, you won't argue with the opposition. Instead, he points out that it's God's project and it's God's idea, and they're going to do it. In verse 12, he said, I had not told anyone what God had put in my heart to do. See, God put the burden on him. It wasn't his idea to rebuild the wall. It was God's idea. And since it was God's idea, they were going to trust God for the success. That's confidence. He answers the opposition quickly and confidently. And this stunned the opposition, but only temporarily, because we will see that several more times in the rest of the book, they continue to oppose them. But this standing against the opposition, this quick and confident standing and saying, no, this is God's plan and we're going to go for it, what it did was it boosted the morale of the Jews in Jerusalem. They'd been defeated for years, and finally, here's this guy who's not afraid to stand up to these folks and say, enough. You don't have a right to do it anymore. You know, in 1 John 3:13, it says, don't be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you. Don't be surprised by these things. If you start to work for the Lord, you're going to get opposition from within and without. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. If you decide that you're going to live your life for Jesus Christ at work or school or anywhere else, somebody's going to have a go at you. That's the reality. That's the reality. And I think once we stop being surprised by that, we won't be so hurt by it. See, Nehemiah knew it was coming, so he planned for it, right? So people are going to question your motives just like they questioned Nehemiah, just like they questioned Jesus. Answer the opposition quickly and confidently. You know, kites rise only against the wind, not with the wind. So we're going to have opposition, and that's okay. Those of you who are already in leadership positions, one of the lessons we learned from this is that there are going to be times when God wants you to do something in your life that other people are not going to get excited about. And it's sad, really, because, you know, you get excited, and then you know, other people aren't excited, and it does, like, it'll hurt. If we're being real, it'll hurt. You're like, you get all pumped up. Yeah, God called me to do this. And nobody else is quite excited. And you go, oh, right. Okay. And it hurts. But the reality is, stick with what God is saying, because if he said it, if you walk in it, it'll happen. That's the reality. Even when I was called to come to Australia, like my pastor and her partner, they said, oh, okay, you know, because they knew not to necessarily doubt that, because other people had come to them and said that, but they're like, oh, how is this going to work, you know? They didn't see that coming. But at least they were supportive, but they kind of were just going, okay. And then God moved, and God moved, and God moved, and they're like, yeah, we knew better than to not believe it. We just didn't see how it was ever going to happen, but there it was. At least they were nice about it. Some people are just really not nice about it. And we just have to realize that. People are not always going to agree with the direction that God's leading you, but sometimes you just have to take a stand. You know, you just have to do it. There's a challenge for all of us, whether we're in a leadership position or not. If you think that everybody is going to be positive about your decision to live for the Lord, think again. They're just not going to. You need to be prepared for the criticism and the ridicule, and you need to decide that you're not going to live, that you're going to live for Jesus Christ no matter what anybody ever thinks. That's the beginning of leadership. You know, Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Sean and I, we meet on Wednesdays for prayer. And one of the things that really hit me when we were praying on Wednesday night is, you know, we were talking about how some people just, you know, really just kind of give up, and they just, you know, and maybe that's why we haven't gotten marriage equality yet, is we've just been so complacent. Now things have changed, whatever it is, I don't know, maybe something in your life or whatever. But the one thing that stuck with me is that, you know, we say we've heard from God, and so we then do, right? And sometimes it doesn't look like what we think it's supposed to look like, and so we get discouraged. But we forget the one thing. We heard from God. It was the silliest thing, I thought, as I was praying. We heard from God. So why would we be afraid to do anything if we heard from God? It struck me. This is the creator of everything speaking to you. So you really, why would we be afraid? Why would we all of a sudden go over here and start thinking all this weird stuff when we heard from God? And I don't know if that sits with you guys, but it sat with me for a minute. Like, you know, we'll say, oh, yes, I heard from the Lord. No. The creator of all of heaven and earth spoke to us. Why then should we be afraid? Maybe because we're afraid of what man can do to us here. Maybe there's that fear of man and what they can do to us. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So if we are called, who do we fear more? And I don't mean, when this word fear of the Lord is not a, ooh, I'm scared fear. It's a reverence. When it came time to leave my job and go into this next phase, I was more afraid not to do it than I was afraid to do it. Because if God has said to do it and I don't, that's a scarier place because I no longer have this covering of God's blessing. But over here, if I'm doing what I'm called to do, I have the covering of God's blessing. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's wise to listen and to follow with the Lord. Amen? I think, I'm loving this series on Nehemiah. I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. These are the ways that we motivate one another. We need to become a bit more discontent, I think, in even speaking to people about our faith. It's not easy in this community to talk about faith because the church has been getting really bad rap. Jesus has gotten a bad rap because his kids are naughty. They're naughty. But Jesus isn't. And that's where we need to hang our flag. On the cross of Christ and on a God who is loving. Let's put our fear there, a reverent fear of God, because there's wisdom there. And we already know love doesn't fail. So if love doesn't fail and we have the wisdom of God, we can't lose. Amen? Let's pray.